fire, 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 fire.
Hi, my name is Josh Gary. I'm a history teacher, and this is Way Back When with Language. The Tudor period was seen as an age of discovery for a number of reasons, but it was primarily linked to technology around ships. Technology around ships meant that during the Tudor period, people from Europe could sail far further than they'd ever been able to sail before, and they, quote unquote, discovered different countries. Of course, these countries had always existed, but the contact and relationship with some of these different continents with Europe wasn't always as well established. The English during the Tudor times, most people would have just been poor farmers. Most people were peasants. Most people were poor. Most people couldn't read or write. Their main form, in many cases, their only form of entertainment quite often came from the church. The whole idea of a holy day or a holiday, as we know today, that came from the church. Churches would teach people how to read. They would teach people how to write. They would take care of the elderly. They would take care of the sick. And in many ways, that's why the Reformation under Henry VIII caused such a massive change, because suddenly a number of these functions that were once carried out by the church no longer existed. And you didn't have a situation in Britain, you didn't have the same situation you have in Britain today, where you had the state, and the state took care of people. And what ended up happening later on, not in the Tudor period, but more so during the Stuart period, was what we call the witch craze, where people were scapegoated and blamed for witchcraft. But really what that was about the state's inability to take care of their vulnerable people. You had migrants, you had a Jewish a group that migrated to England. You also had what we call the Huguenots from France, and they were Protestants who were basically killed and massacred as a result of their beliefs. Now, you also had Africans living in Tudor England at the time, and the interesting thing about Africans living in Tudor England was that these Africans married, mainly men. They married people in Tudor England. They were baptized, and they were buried. And that's a very important and significant thing, because what we need to understand is religion was probably the most important thing for somebody living in Tudor England. So if somebody was allowed to become baptized, if somebody was allowed to be buried, if somebody was allowed to marry into a community, that is a key indicator of acceptance. Otherness, like we know it, may not have existed in that same way. I believe if somebody came from a different country, for example, a different continent, people would be very curious, because people didn't travel by and large. This is when technology started to allow more and more people to travel and, for want of a better word, discover. Africans came to Tudor England for a variety of reasons. I think what's important to establish is that there was a relationship with the continent of Africa and Europe that had existed for centuries. African kingdoms were very, very used to trading with their European counterparts. Many Europeans tended to go to Africa because of the wealth. They wanted the gold. There were, kind of legends or fables that, you can go into fields and literally pick diamonds from these fields. So from the European point of view, the wealth greatly attracted them to Africa. Europeans traveled to Africa because they wanted the wealth. They wanted access to the wealth. They wanted to form relationships with them, political relationships to fight against the growth of Islam. But they also had the technology that would take them there. They were very aware of, kingdoms such as Benin, which is in modern-day Nigeria, Oyo, which is also in modern-day Nigeria, Dahomey, which is in modern-day Benin. You had the Kingdom of Ghana as well. So these are the things that first attracted Europeans to Africa, and that is a key reason why some Africans started to go to Europe. There's an example of 5 West Africans who came to England, and their sole purpose was for them to become, for them to learn English, to act as interpreters or to act as translators, when the English would go over and conduct trade in Africa. The kings in Africa were very, very aware of how wealthy Africa was, and they were very, very much the ones in power at the time. So that's one reason why there was some, at least they were an example of Africans who came over to Europe to act as translators. You'd have some enslaved Africans would end up in parts of what we call the New World. And the key reason why they were there was to work on plantations to produce various different things, such as sugar, such as tobacco. What the Spanish and Portuguese found when they went to the Americas was that for production of these crops was very, very labor intensive. And originally they used indentured servants, but indentured servants who were usually poor people from Europe would only work a certain period. And a number of the Native Americans died as a result of the disease, or they successfully resisted. And that created a demand for workers. And that demand for workers led to them looking to Africa. Whilst you'd have some enslaved Africans ending up in the New World, you'd also have some enslaved Africans ending up in Europe. Now, you would have had some Africans who may have moved as a part of being a royal court. So there's a suggestion that John Blanc may have actually been a part of Catherine of Aragon's court, although this can't be confirmed. Catherine of Aragon being from Spain, when she married into England, her court would move with her. You'd also have different pockets of people moving over to England in the quest for freedom, because the key thing about coming over to England was when you moved to England, you were free. Whereas in Spain, Portugal at the very least, they had that understanding of slavery because they were operating in the New Worlds. John Blanc was a trumpet player he was a trumpet player for Henry VII and he was a trumpet player for Henry VIII. And John Blanc throws another very interesting story during the Tudor period. I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we even know about John Blanc? And we know about John Blanc through what is known as the Westminster Roll, which is a really, really large tapestry where we actually see John Blanc. And he's important because he's one of the first Africans who we have a name for and who we actually have a story behind. Now, John Blanc's story is very interesting. John Blanc caught wind that some of his fellow trumpeters were earning more money than him, which he didn't like, and he wrote a petition to Henry VIII asking for more money. When I first heard this story, I thought Henry VIII would dismiss him on the mere point that he was of another ethnicity. Henry VIII actually granted him his pay rise. And when John Blanc got married, Henry VIII bought him gifts for his wedding. Now, John Blanc disappears in history after this point, but here we have an example of an African who has an identity, who has a name, and who isn't subject to racism. And not only is he not subject to racism that we know, or he may have been, he at least had a self-worth that meant he can ask for a pay rise. And I think that's a very interesting story when looking at Africans. And I guess the question I always ask myself is, how did we get from the Cimarrons working with Sir Francis Drake to the transatlantic slave trade? When looking at history, one of the things that's very important, it's very, very important not to take the ideas we have today and place them in the past. Ideas of racism and institutional racism are so deeply ingrained in our society today didn't quite exist in Tudor England. That's not to say that there wasn't hostility and there wasn't areas of difference or areas of disagreement, but the racism and the acts of racism that we experience today weren't necessarily around back then. The idea that black people fit a certain stereotype today didn't necessarily exist back then. Evidence suggests that the black people in England were able to integrate. They were able to get married to people. They were able to get buried. They were able to get baptized. And that's important because the everyday life for somebody living in Tudor England revolved around religion. And if there's evidence of Africans being able to participate in these religious activities, there's every indication that these black people were able to integrate in Tudor England. So my closing thoughts. Once again, migration was a key thing in Tudor England, just like it was a key theme in Roman Britain. Not only was migration a key theme, but there were Africans in Tudor England, and the Africans in Tudor England were able to integrate into society. Racism, as we know it, didn't exist in Tudor England, and that's racism in terms of black and white, which comes into play later on during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries.